Right, good day, grade 12. Today we are going to look at import substitution. This is the next topic in chapter 5. Unfortunately, I don't have the textbook with me at this stage. Things are a bit messed up today. But just look in the textbook. This is straight after the work that we did yesterday. Straight after export promotion. The second topic is import substitution. Now remember, yesterday we spoke about the inward-looking strategies and outward-looking strategies. When we look at outward strategies, outward-focusing strategies, it is all about encouraging something. And that which we did yesterday, the export promotion, that is an example of an outward-looking strategy. If we look at inward-looking strategies, that is about discouraging something, and that is what we are going to look at today. Today we're looking at import substitution. As I mentioned earlier, this is a possible essay question. Okay, so it is very important also that you study it as an essay question. All right, so if this is asked as an essay question, obviously your introduction will be your definition. All right, so what is import substitution? Import substitution is the replacement of goods that was previously imported by domestic production. In other words, instead of importing something, we are going to start an industry in our country and we're going to start producing things that we never produced previously. But then if we establish new industries and we're producing varied things, we are then going to use local things instead of importing. So we are basically substituting an imported product with a locally manufactured product. Now, instead of importing it, we decide to manufacture it ourselves. Okay. Now, the reasons for import substitution, the first one there is diversification. Diversification is the opposite of specialization. All right. Now, there's obviously a danger in over-specialization. If South Africa literally decides that we are only going to specialize in the production of gold, and then we only rely on gold as a source of income, obviously when the gold price falls, we have nothing else to sell. So then we will be forced to sell our gold at those low prices, possibly at a loss, because we have nothing else to sell. All right, so if we want to diversify, it means that we are wanting to produce more different things. Now we're starting to produce more things than what we used to produce. And often for developing countries, import substitution is a logical place to start with diversification. All right, you can think if we are currently importing a product, the fact that it is being imported already indicates to us that there is a demand for that product. Otherwise, we would not be importing it. So for us to start a new industry in our country, we know the demand is already there. All right, so import substitution is an easy way to start diversifying. We know what the demand is, and then we just decide to satisfy that demand ourselves. Second point, often it is argued that the industrial base of our economy needs to be strengthened and expanded. That's what I explained earlier. We don't want to depend on foreign countries for too many things. All right, food, for example, it is very, very dangerous to depend on another country as a food source because anything can happen. We do not control, we have no control over what happens internationally. We have no control over what happens in other countries. All right. So if we are depending on a foreign country for food, for example, should that foreign country have a drought, obviously what food they have, they're going to feed their own people. They're not going to be giving us any food, and then we don't have food. If they sanction us, okay, there's bad trade relations between us and the other country, and they start refusing to trade with us, again, we are not going to have access to food. All right, so we don't want to depend on foreign countries too much. Obviously, we cannot produce everything for ourselves. That kind of also can't happen, but we cannot over-specialize. All right, when we talk about specialization, we cannot literally say that in South Africa we are specializing only in the production of minerals. Then we are going to have no agriculture, no tertiary sector, no secondary sector. That would be stupid. All right, so diversification is just an attempt by the country to make us less dependent on other countries. Right. The second reason, in terms of trade, developing countries often rely on their natural resources as a basis for economic growth and development. If you think to last year, grade 11, we did the characteristics of developing countries, and one of those characteristics was that developing countries rely on the primary sector. Right, so many developing countries, because they're poor, they don't have the capital that wealthier countries do, they don't have the technology, so very often they rely on primary goods. Their secondary sector is almost non-existent, their tertiary sector is really small, so what they have available to export will be mainly primary goods. Right, so mainly kind of unprocessed raw materials that they've taken out in the primary sector. Right, now for primary sector goods, the demand for these goods are fairly stable, and even substantial changes in the prices will have no significant influence on demand, all right? Because obviously most of those things will be seen as essential. Food, agriculture gives us food. Food is essential. Even if food becomes very expensive, we still have to buy food, otherwise we die. Okay, so it's inelastic. The demand for primary goods tends to be more inelastic. All right, even if the price goes up, people are still going to buy them. All right, but your primary goods, it's unsuitable as a basis for economic growth. Developing countries are developing countries for a reason, because they rely on primary goods only. Right, developing countries don't have an alternative but to produce for themselves the manufactured goods that they import. All right, and again, the fact that these goods are imported, so because technology is not available in their country to process basically their raw materials into something useful. Remember, they export mainly primary goods, unprocessed goods, to developed countries. In developed countries, those unprocessed raw materials are processed, it's turned into finished goods and services, and then those things are sold back to the developing countries, obviously at a higher price. If you are buying an unprocessed product, the prices are relatively low. So the money that they receive for the imports is relatively low, but the money that they pay when they buy the finished goods is higher. All right, so obviously money flows out of these countries. They constantly have a deficit because constantly they're earning very little and they have to pay a lot when they import the finished goods. And once again, the fact that certain goods are imported, again, it shows us that the demand for those goods exists. There is a demand for it. It will be easy if they are able to establish an industry to process their own raw materials, and then they don't have to import the finished goods if they are able then to make it themselves. If we look at the forms of import substitution, there's two forms of import substitution. The first one is voluntary. The second one is involuntary, and it's forced. All right. Now, when we talk about voluntary import substitution, this is when the country decides of its own free will to replace goods that are imported. So the government will basically just make a decision that we need to develop our industrial base, we want to reduce our dependence on other countries, and we make physically a decision to say, okay, we no longer want to import from other countries, so we are going to start industries in our own country and we're going to produce this ourselves. But it is voluntary. We decide that we don't want to import anymore, that we would rather produce it ourselves. An example of voluntary import substitution was in 1928, when the government of South Africa back then decided to establish Iscor as an industry. Before that, we would export our iron ore and we would have to import the stainless steel and the steel products from other countries where they process the raw materials. But in 1928, the government just decided, no, we don't want to do this anymore. We are now going to produce our own, take our own iron ore and process our own iron ore. So that in 1928, they established Iscor. It was a voluntary decision that they took just to reduce their dependence on other countries. If we look at the other one, the forced import substitution, this is when countries are forced to produce certain goods because they are excluded from taking part in international trade. So it's not a voluntary decision that countries take because we cannot access certain goods and services on the international markets because of things like sanctions and boycotts. I'll talk about that now. obviously, if we want those products, we would have to import or produce it ourselves. No, we are not allowed to import, so we have to produce it ourselves. But this is not a voluntary decision that we are taking. We have to start producing ourselves because other countries refuse to sell it to us. All right. Now, we can be excluded from international trade that can force us to do import substitution if there is a sanction, right? A trade sanction is when foreign countries prohibit trade with a certain country, okay? So they're not allowed to trade with us. In terms of a boycott, that's a voluntary measure where a country decides just not to trade with a certain country in a certain product or not to trade with us at all. A boycott is less severe than a sanction. Okay, when there's a sanction, it means they are not allowed. They're prohibited completely from trading with us. But in the terms of a boycott, it's a more relaxed view. A country will just decide. There's no legal requirement. They're not prohibited. They just decide that they are not going to trade with us. And then the last one, in terms of disinvestments, that is when foreign countries withdraw their investments from a country. So where they've previously invested money in a country, when they remove those investments, they take their money out of the country again, that is called disinvestment. Okay. Now, one example of forced import substitution was when the previous government started or established Arms Corps. Okay, Arms Corps back then, nowadays it's called DNL. Okay. That is an example of forced import substitution. In the 1980s, South Africa had a lot of sanctions against us because of the system of apartheid. We had lots of sanctions and there was a general weapons sanction against South Africa. So South Africa was unable to buy weapons from anybody. No other country in the world would sell weapons to our government of back then, the previous government. Because of that sanction, it was illegal for any other countries to sell weapons to us. All right. And obviously, our defense force and the police, whatever, they needed weapons, right? So when the previous government started Arms Corps, this was basically, and I say that with all respect meant, this was basically the previous government's way of giving the rest of the world the middle finger. All right. The rest of the world wanted us to go, oh, I'm so sorry. But instead of doing that, we said, no, pick a finger. We don't need your stupid weapons. We will start our own industry, and the government established Arms Corps. All right. And the thing with Arms Corps is that with Arms Corps, they grew into one of the biggest weapons manufacturers in the world. So now those same countries that wouldn't sell us weapons are buying weapons from us. All right. I don't know if that's something to be proud of. Weapons kill people, and we are really good at that. I don't know if that's something that we should be proud of. But obviously, Arms Corps grew into an industrial giant where we went from making no weapons ourselves, no guns or anything ourselves, into being one of the leading manufacturers in the world where that is concerned. All right. So we were good at it. We didn't even know that we were good at it. And they forced us to do this. And then we realized, we're actually good at this. Okay, when we go to the methods of import substitution, all right, these can also be used in an exam if they ask methods of import substitution, but they can also be used if they ask for methods of protection, all right, because all of these methods that we're going to do today is also used to protect our local industries, all right, but I will refer back to this when we do the lesson on protection tomorrow. Okay, the first one, the most commonly used one, is tariffs, customs duties or import taxes. That's exactly the same thing. Whether you call it tariffs, customs duties, import taxes, it's the same thing. It is a tax that is levied on imported products. Why do we levy a tax on imported products? First of all, because we protect our local producers against foreign competition. What happens is we import Italian pasta. Okay, we have a local pasta manufacturer and we import pasta. When consumers goes to the shops, sometimes they will always, consumers always have a limited income. They are looking for the best deal. Now, they want to spend a lot of money on something. If they can buy a cheaper packet of pasta, they've got money left over for a chocolate. And chocolate is always the right answer. Okay, so when the consumer goes to the shop, he sees 2 packets of pasta. The local pasta is 20 Rand a packet. The imported pasta is 15 Rand a packet. Which one is he going to buy? The imported, cheaper, 15 Rand a packet pasta. Right. But then by our consumers buying the imported pasta, we are creating jobs for Italian people there in Italy. All right. Okay, we feel sorry for them now, but we don't want to buy their pasta. We need to support our local industries. So if nobody buys the local pasta, what is going to happen to the local pasta producer? His business is going to close down. People are going to lose their jobs. All right. We have to protect our local producers against foreign competition. The next lesson is all about that. Okay. Then I'm going to explain it a bit more. So what do? We levy a tax. All right. Now, when the imported pasta comes into the country, we think, we're going to levy a customs duty so that that imported pasta's price goes up to 22 rand. Now people go to the shop, they see, local pasta, 20 rand. Imported pasta, 22 rand. Now which one do they buy? The local pasta. And we support our local industries and we create jobs for our local people. All right. So that's the first reason why we levy a customs duty. We need to protect our local producers and our local jobs against foreign competition. We need to encourage people to buy local products. Secondly, because a customs duty is a tax, obviously all taxes serves as a revenue for the government. So again, the more import taxes people pay, the higher the revenue of the government. And obviously the government needs as much revenue as what they can get. Second, the last reason there, it also makes imports more expensive and therefore it discourages imports. The law of demand says the higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded. So if we make our imports really, really expensive, it will discourage imports, which means, remember, import is a leakage, so it means less money is flowing out of the country, which will benefit the balance of payments. Now, it can actually help us to create a surplus on the balance of payments. Okay, now we distinguish between three different types of tariffs based on how we calculate these tariffs. The first one is called a specific tariff. That is when a fixed amount is levied per unit, weight or size of the imported goods. All right, so the tax is levied as an amount. All right, so for example, we're going to pay 15 rand tax per unit. Okay, so 15 rand tax per packet of pasta or whatever. Okay, 20 rand per kilogram of sugar, whatever, right? But it is a specific amount per unit or mass. The second one, the ad valorem tariff, is when the customs duty is levied as a percentage of the value of the imported goods. So instead of paying an amount of tax, you're going to pay a percentage of tax. All right. So just the way that the tax is calculated works differently. All right. So it's levied as a percentage. So for example, you're going to pay a customs duty of 20% on the value of the imported car, for example. All right. It's just a different way of calculating it. The last one is a composite or multiple discriminatory tariff. This is when both a specific and an ad valorem tariff is levied on the goods. All right, so for example, this will be used in cases where we really don't want those goods to come into this country, or we really have bad trade relations with that country. We don't want to buy from them. Then we're going to smack them with two taxes on top of each other. All right, so then we're going to say, right, we are levying a 5 rand tax per unit, plus after that, another 12% on the value of the product. So we are taxing them basically twice, okay? 2 customs duties. We call it discriminatory because it's specifically done for products that we don't want to let into this country. So we really want to discourage those imports. Or, as I said, it's used with countries that we really have bad trade relations with. All right. Now, regardless of which type of tariff we use, whether you use a specific or an ad valorem tax or a composite tariff, regardless of what you do, it will push up the price of imported goods. Remember from chapter 1, taxes are added when we go to market prices. All right. Remember, all of these, the customs duties will be a tax on products. All right. So when we go from basic prices to market prices, you're going to add these customs duties. It is an extra amount that people have to pay. So it increases the price and it discourages imports because, as I said, the law of demand says the higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded. All right. So obviously lower quantity demanded means that the demand for imports will decrease. Not as many people would want to import these goods anymore because it is now too expensive. The second method that we can use is called an import quota. Okay? A quota is where we place a restriction on the amount of articles that we allow into the country. So when we place a restriction on the quantity of goods that may be imported, we're not increasing the price, we are restricting the quantity that we allow into the country, then it is called an import quota. All right. Now, because we are restricting the amount of goods that can be imported, in other words, we are restricting supply. Our supply now is lower because we're only allowing a limited number in. Because of the decrease in supply, prices ultimately will increase as well. Now, through demand and supply, if your demand stays constant, but your supply decreases, the price of those goods will increase as well. But it doesn't increase because of a tax, it increases because of scarcity, the decrease in supply. Now, South Africa, we have abolished most of our import quotas as required by the World Trade Organization. Okay, remember, we are supposed to move towards free trade and away from protectionism, and quotas is something that they really, really frown upon. All right, so we are supposed to abandon most of our quotas, and we have, okay, with detrimental effects to some of our industries. We will discuss that later when we do free trade. All right, but we don't have a lot of quotas. We do still have some, but we have abolished a lot of them. Two different types of quotas that we can find. We either use a general quota or we can use an allocated or discriminatory quota. In terms of a general quota, we place a general restriction on imports. So we don't mention countries or anything like that. We are just going to say, right, we are putting an import quota on gadgets. We can only import 500 gadgets. All right, so it doesn't matter where these 500 gadgets come from, but as soon as we have imported 500, that's it. We cannot import any more gadgets. Anybody else that would want a gadget now would have to buy from local sources. All right, so again, we are protecting our local industries because we are limiting the amount of imports that can be bought, and the rest has to be bought from local sources. An allocated or discriminatory quota is where we place a restriction on goods coming from a particular country. So again, discriminatory because we are going to use this to target a specific country that we have bad trade relations with. All right, so an example of a discriminatory quota would be we import only 500 gadgets, that's a general quota, but of that 500 gadgets, only 100 gadgets may come from China. All right, so we are discriminating against China because the other countries can send us lots and lots, but China, we only want 100 of their gadgets. Okay, in terms of foreign exchange controls, we did speak about this in chapter 4 as well. This is when the government limits the amount of foreign currency available to importers. Now remember, we said that when we import, each country expects to be paid in their own currency. All right, so in order to buy stuff from America, we would first have to be able to buy dollars. If we don't have dollars, we cannot import from America. All right, so when the government limits our access to currency like dollars, if we only have access to a certain amount of dollars, we can only import a certain amount because once our dollars are finished, then we can't get more dollars. All right, so when they limit the amount of foreign currency, they're basically cutting us off at the source. Without the currency, we cannot buy the imported goods. Okay, remember we have foreign exchange controls in our country. We said that every person in our country, there is a limit to the amount of currency that each person is able to buy in a given financial year. And remember, I said you physically have to prove, you have to explain why you need this foreign currency. You can't just randomly go and buy foreign currency, okay? All of that is part of foreign exchange controls. Plus, any foreign exchange earnings by residents. So if you are an exporter and you happen to earn foreign exchange, whatever, you are compelled by law to hand that over to the central bank. Okay, and remember also we said if you've traveled and you come back and you have dollars left, you are also compelled by law to return that to your bank which will then obviously turn it back into rand. All right. Diverting trade. Okay, there's a couple of measures here. This is measures that is aimed at just making it difficult to import goods from abroad. Now we make it difficult for people. So remember, people like when things are easy and things can just kind of happen. As soon as something becomes more difficult, some people are going to be discouraged. Now they can say, no, I'm not going to import this. This is way too much trouble. All right. The first measure there is import deposits. This is when the government requires importers of goods, normally it's luxury goods, to make a cash deposit that is equal to the fixed percentage of the value of the goods ordered. With an import deposits, for example, let's say you want to import a luxury vehicle. Now you are very, very wealthy and you would like to import yourself the latest, greatest Apple red Ferrari. All right. Now there's not many people in South Africa that can afford to buy a Ferrari. Okay. So the thinking is that if you want to import one and once it's here, you decide you don't want it anymore, it's going to be very difficult to find another buyer. All right. So when you want to import a luxury item like that, the government requires you to make a cash deposit. Okay. So they can say 20%. 20% of the value of that car you must give to the Reserve Bank in cash. Okay. So not on a bank loan, not whatever. You must have that cash in your back pocket, in your wallet, in cash. You have to put it down before you are allowed to import that product. Now you can imagine on a Ferrari, let's say it's like 2 million rand Ferrari that you want to import, 20% of that is a crap load of money and you have to have that available in cash. All right, so it's a way of the government making sure that you can actually afford this import. It's not going to arrive here and then you say, oh, yeah, no, I actually can't afford to pay for this. All right, if you have that money in cash, it means that you have access to enough money to pay for this product. Administrative obstacles is just the time-consuming customs procedures, the paperwork, the admin that has to be done if you want to import. All right, to give you an example, if you actually import stuff, let's say you import stuff through Durban Harbour. Once the stuff arrives from the foreign country into Durban Harbour, it can take up to 6 months before you actually even see your stuff because it gets there to the harbour, those containers gets dropped off at the harbour, and now customs officials have to work through those containers. They literally have to open up those containers. They have to check what is inside. They have to count them. They have to levy the tax. It's a whole procedure. So you are going to wait for a long, long time. All right. So the more procedures there are and the longer that it takes and the more paperwork there is, the more difficult they make it for the importers to actually do this. And then people are just discouraged. They're going to stuff it. Okay, I'm not even going to import this because it's like going to take forever and it's just too much admin. And then the last one, right, the quality standards. This means that governments of different countries can specify certain quality control standards like licensing or safety standards or anti-pollution regulations or labor requirements or whatever for imported goods. All right. So these standards is protective measures if domestic producers are exempted from these standards. Now what this means, and you'll see when we go to free trade, I'm going to talk about this as well. A lot of developed countries are using quality standards as a reason to not trade with developing countries. All right. If you can think developing countries, remember people are suffering. They're not technologically advanced. They have low levels of income. So they can't afford maybe to care about the environment. In a developing country, if they need to dump stuff in a river, they're going to do it. Because if they have to dispose of their waste in an environmentally responsible way, it's going to cost them extra money, and it's money that they don't necessarily have. All right. Developed countries, they have the money and they don't even stick to these anti-pollution regulations. But now they will use this as a reason to not trade with a developing country. And under free trade and the World Trade Organization's provisions, this is actually allowed because it's not a quota, it's not a tax. I am not going to trade with you because you are polluting the earth. I am not going to trade with you because you are not having minimum wages or whatever. Okay, so they're using this to hide behind, to use as reasons to not trade with developing countries that are really struggling. The last form of import substitution is physical controls. Okay, I did refer to this earlier. This is, for example, your sanctions and boycotts. All right. So this normally takes the form of a complete ban or embargo, sanction on the import of certain goods. All right. Now, the embargo or the sanction can be the ban on an export or import of a product from a particular country, like South Africa. And we had lots of sanctions against us in the 80s. All right. So then no country would trade anything with us. Okay. So there can be a complete embargo, a complete ban on any kind of trade with a particular country, but we can also place a ban on certain products. All right. So for example, a country can ban the export of weapons to a country with a poor human rights record. So if we know, for example, that in, Syria, in Syria, there's a lot of human rights violations and there's two different factions and people are getting killed left, right and center and women and children are being raped and what. We can say, you know what? Because of the human rights violations there, we are not going to export weapons there because then we are enabling those abuses. All right. So then it's a ban against a country. But we can also, as I said, place a ban on the trade in certain products. All right. For example, drugs. It is illegal. We have a total complete ban on imports and exports of recreational drugs. Now I'm talking cocaine and marijuana and I don't know what you guys are using nowadays, what the modern drugs are. But that is banned completely. It cannot come in. I'm not saying it doesn't because it does, right? But legally, it cannot enter the country or exit the country. There's a ban, for example, also on trade in foreign animals. All right. So we can't trade in foreign animals or in protected animals or anything like that. Dangerous chemicals or whatever. We can place this ban on any product that we do not want to come in or out of our country or against a specific country, as I explained. Right. What are the advantages of import substitution? There's always positive and there's always negative. First of all, it does lead to increased employment because now, remember, if we buy local, we are supporting our local industries. We are creating jobs for South African people instead of buying imported goods and sending our money to China and creating jobs for Chinese people. All right. So because we are establishing a new industry to replace those imported goods, a new industry obviously also needs to hire workers. So local workers are going to be employed to work in our local factories. And obviously there's a higher employment rate. The whole economy will be stimulated, higher levels of income, higher levels of spending, and our GDP and economic growth can also increase. Second advantage is that our domestic businesses will capture a larger share of the market. Okay, so industrial development is encouraged. As I said, because it's import substitution, remember previously we used to import these goods. We didn't have an industry to produce these goods, but now we are establishing a whole new industry. So we're creating industrial development. We are widening, diversifying our industrial base. And because we are establishing a whole new industry, as I said, we're also going to stimulate job creation and economic growth. I did mention earlier that it will improve the balance of payments because we no longer are importing. Now, our imports are going to decrease. So if our imports are decreasing, remember, imports are leakages. Money will leave the country. But if we are decreasing our imports, there will be less money that is leaving the country. And as a result of that, obviously, less money leaving means that if we have a deficit on the balance of payments, it can actually create a surplus. Now, if our export stays the same, if we export the same amount, but we increase our imports, the deficit will decrease or even turn into a surplus. Plus, if we are not importing, remember, if we are importing stuff from America, that means we are buying dollars to pay for American goods. If we are buying dollars, we are selling rand. If we sell rand and sell rand and sell rand, we are making rand easily available, and that will depreciate the rand. But when we do import substitution and we no longer import so much, it decreases the amount of rand that is sold on the foreign exchange market, and it will strengthen the value of the rand. Next advantage is that it increases our independence. Okay, remember right at the beginning of this lesson, I said when we are dependent on other countries too much, we cannot depend on other countries too much. It is dangerous, right? So our reliance on imports, if we don't import as much, if we establish industries and we try to produce these things rather ourselves, we are reducing our reliance on imports. We are reducing our dependence on other countries. So we will be less vulnerable to any international events that can create shortages. All right. If we are importing oil, for example, from wherever, Iran, Iraq, wherever, Kuwait, wherever, should there be a war in those countries, we have no control over that, but we will have no access to oil because now this international event is impacting on us. Okay, oil is a bad example because it's not something that we can produce. It is something that we actually have to find in nature, all right? But any reliance that we have on another country, we rely on another country for a certain thing. If that country, something happens, a sanction, a drought, a war, and that country no longer can supply us, obviously we have a problem. All right, it's better to start producing it early on, to recognize our potential, do it early on, and then we don't have to rely on them. We have more control if it's produced in our country. Not total control, but more control. All right, it gives our consumers also more choice. All right, so now we're not saying we're going to stop imports altogether. We are decreasing imports. All right, so now goods are not just imported, we are also producing locally. All right, so foreign exchange that becomes available, okay, because now we are not importing anymore, so we are not spending our foreign exchange on these imports. The foreign exchange that we do have, we can use for other imports, so things that maybe we never had before, and that will increase the choices that is made available to consumers. And remember, when consumers have a wider choice, automatically their standards of living will also increase. Okay, diversification we spoke about at the beginning of this chapter. Obviously, it creates a broader industrial base. There's a greater variety of goods and services that we can physically produce in our country. More businesses are being established, creating choices for consumers. And obviously, when supply increases, prices will decrease as long as demand stays the same. So if more businesses are producing a larger variety of different things, more goods are available, different varieties for consumers to choose from. Consumers like having choices, okay? You don't like, I know a lot of you complaining, I know, my kids too, right? About no takeaways now, né? Every other Friday before lockdown, that you were spoiled for choice. You could go to KFC or Nando's or Steers or Burger King or McDonald's. And I know some of you, this is your biggest heart choice right now is to have a McDonald's burger, right? It gives you choices. Now you're stuck in lockdown with your parents. Sorry, parents. Ne? Now you have no choice. Your mother tells you, tonight we are eating, I don't know, pap and wors. And you don't have a choice. You can't say, no. What else is available on the menu? Ne? Nothing else. You eat it or you go hungry. Right. So people don't like not having choices. And import substitution gives us more choices, more things to choose from, and because of the increase in supply, lower prices. The disadvantages, now everything always comes with disadvantages as well. The disadvantages of import substitution, first of all, emerging economies. Okay, emerging economies is developing countries. China is an emerging economy. Brazil is an emerging economy. Right, it's developing countries with relatively high economic growth rates. Not currently so much because of Corona, right? But normally, okay. Normally, some emerging economies, they cannot afford to decrease imports of certain goods. Okay, so for example, South Africa, we are a developing country. We have a lack of investment in machinery and equipment. We don't produce a lot of machinery and equipment ourselves. Okay, we import huge amounts of capital goods. One of the top 5 imports into our country will be machinery and equipment. Okay, we simply do not have the industries to produce a lot of this ourselves, so we have to import those capital goods. Okay, but now because we have a lack of capital resources, it reduces our ability to produce certain consumer goods and services. So should we decide, for example, to start producing something ourselves, and we establish an industry to produce these things ourselves, but now in order to produce these things, we need machinery and equipment. So now we're not importing gadgets anymore, but we have to import machines and equipment to produce the gadgets in our own country. So we are basically just replacing one type of import with a different type of import. Okay, so we are trying to decrease imports, but by trying to produce things ourselves, we realize we don't have the technology and we have to import that technology anyway. It doesn't really even create a decrease in overall imports. It's not going to make any kind of difference. Okay, the second problem is that our local businesses become isolated from international competition. Okay, yesterday we spoke about the benefits of competition. The more competition I have, the more it forces me to be more efficient. It forces me to find a new production method so I can do things better. It forces me to improve my quality and reduce my prices. Now, because I'm protected from international competition, I am not going to have a reason to become efficient. Okay, so if my production method sucks and my prices are really high, it's okay. Because when the imported stuff comes and it's cheaper, what does the government do? They levy a tax. They make my inefficient piece of crap look cheaper. All right. So no producer is being forced to do better. All right. By exposing them to international competition, we can force them to do better. But now with import substitution, we cover their inefficiencies with taxes. We make the important things look more expensive. We are forcing consumers to buy a more expensive thing, and we're not forcing our businesses to actually shape up. Okay, that leads into the next one, which is the consumers are going to pay higher prices. So now, before import substitution, it was nice. We went to the shop, imported pasta was 15 Rand, the local stuff was 20 Rand, we ignored it, it's too expensive. We bought the imported pasta and yay, we can buy chocolate as well. But now, after import substitution, the government decides, we can't buy the imported pasta. They levy a tax. Now the imported pasta looks like 25 Rand a packet. So now we are forced to go and pay 20 Rand for a local packet of pasta, where before we could have paid 15 for an imported packet of pasta. All right. So they're basically forcing our local consumers to pay higher prices. They could have had access to the cheaper imports, but we are denying them. Plus, sometimes, I'm not saying this is always the case, sometimes the quality of the local goods also is not as high as the imported goods. But we all know sometimes the imported stuff is crap also, okay? It's just sometimes it does happen that now we are forced to pay the higher price for the local stuff and then the quality is not even that great. Okay. Next problem is that the cost of raw materials is also higher. Okay, again, because we are importing some raw materials. All right, so any business that has to import raw materials, and oil is a raw material. Okay, we don't have any oil, we have to import oil. So if we're now going to impose a tariff or a quota on any imported raw materials, obviously we are pushing up the prices of those raw materials. And raw materials, if we pay more for raw materials, our production cost goes up. So the local businesses have a higher production cost as a result of tariffs and quotas. And because their production cost goes up, what do they do with their selling prices? They put it up. Okay, because they still want to make a profit. All right. So it reduces our competitiveness overall. Right, because our prices are now higher because of the tariffs and the quotas that we actually have to pay. And this has the problem that now it can also reduce our exports. All right, because the minute our prices goes up now, we become less competitive, our local our consumers will suffer, plus we will know the demand for our exports will decrease because who wants our expensive crap? Okay, I'm almost done. Right, technology, next problem, is borrowed from abroad. Okay, this is a very biggie as well. All the technology that we import, when other countries develop technology, they develop that technology for their purposes. They develop that technology to suit them. Okay, now we don't have technology of our own, and we now import this technology from another country. All right, and the technology that we are buying and bringing into the country is not necessarily suitable for use here in South Africa. I take you back to the trains that the government bought a while ago. Right, they imported all these beautiful trains, and when they arrived in South Africa, The trains were too high. All right, they were too high, so they couldn't fit onto our railways because of the electricity lines. So they paid millions of rands for this technology and they are useless. We cannot use them. They were designed to be used in a different country with a different situation. Okay, another example, geysers, solar geysers. All right, solar geysers, there's different options. Okay, there's cheaper options, there's more expensive options. What do our government do? Cheapskates. Okay, we can't criticize them too much. I'm trying to help us now, ne? But they bought cheaper solar geysers. These solar geysers was made in countries where weather patterns are significantly different than ours. All right, so they installed these solar geysers in South Africa. And then the rain came. Rainstorms, hailstorms, lightning, thunderstorms, and the hail and whatever, it destroyed those solar geysers because the material that they used was not suitable for use in South Africa. All right, the minute that we get technology from another country, it is not necessarily designed for us. It is designed for the other country. All right, and that creates problems sometimes. Okay, I spoke about the currency strengthen. Remember, if we're reducing our imports, I'm going to say again, if we import from America, we need to pay them in dollars. So on the foreign exchange market, we need to buy dollars. When I'm buying dollars, I am selling rand. And if I sell rand and sell rand and sell rand and sell some more rand, I am flooding the market with rand. I am making rand easily available. And we all know what easy means. Easy means cheap. Ne? Remember those girls that I spoke about in class, right? Cheap. Ne? Anybody can have access. Prices will fall. All right, but if we are reducing our imports, we are buying less from America, we are buying less dollars, we are selling less rand. Less rand on the market can mean that rand can become a little bit more scarce and therefore the rand will appreciate. Okay, but on the disadvantage side, remember we're busy with disadvantages, right? When the rand appreciates, what happens? Now the rand is too strong. Again, it's cheaper now to import again. We start importing again. It's expensive for other countries to buy from us. So our exports becomes too expensive. Our exports will decrease. And that again is going to cause a deficit on the balance of payments. Lose-lose situation.